Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another Top 10. This is a Top 10 Quentin Tarantino, but seeing he's only done 8, this Top 10 will be a Top 5. Now, Tarantino is a filmmaker that divides a lot of people. He's a filmmaker that I had a lot of high hopes for after Reservoir Dogs. He's a director that has lots of good stuff in his films, but he has a lot of stuff that's quite frustrating, and I think we all kind of know what the issues are with these films. But he doesn't seem to, because he does have somewhat of an ego. So he's certainly not amongst my favourite filmmakers, but paradoxically I do tend to get all of his films, because all of his films are worth seeing and worth owning. But it just is a bit frustrating. So you can leave your own top 5 in the comments below. See if we agree. I'm sure we probably won't. And let's get started. I will probably bring up the issues with Tarantino, the good and the bad, as we go along. So at number 5 of the top 5 Tarantino films is The Hateful Eight. Now this is his latest film, and it's a western, and it's essentially 8 angry people. But I think the reason I like this is because he shot it in 70mm. I watch my films on a wall, on a projector, and this looks absolutely beautiful. And that's one of the good things about Tarantino. His films look absolutely gorgeous. They sound great, and they look absolutely stunning. This one has a score by Ennio Morricone, so you can't do wrong with that. Is it perfect? No. Is it overlong? Yes. This is... Where is it? 167 minutes, which I believe is just about the same length as Once Upon a Time in the West by Sergio Leone, which absolutely flies by. And this is where we get to problem number 1 with Tarantino. He can't edit himself. Pretty much every film since Reservoir Dogs could be shorter and should be shorter. Hateful Eight, Inglourious Bastards, Django Unchained, all have excellent 90-minute films inside them, but unfortunately in this case it's 167 minutes. So there's always a point where you're really into it, you're really enjoying it, it's coming along, and then these films just generally grind to a halt, and you just go, why is this in here? It's just it's just ego, and he can't edit himself. There's something to be said for a collaborator. There's something to be said for somebody to bounce ideas off, but because Tarantino has this auteur thing, and I'm sure he's a self-proclaimed genius, I don't think he has anybody to say, you know what, we could trim this by 15 minutes or an hour. I mean, I'll get to Reservoir Dogs later. Sorry, that was a spoiler. Yes, The Hateful Eight is essentially an Agatha Christie in the snow, in the West, about a bounty hunter taking somebody to be hanged, and falls in with a group of people who may or may not be what they seem. So it's essentially an Agatha Christie story. Obviously there's lots of Tarantino dialogue. There's great performances: Jennifer Jason Leigh, Kurt Russell, Bruce Dern, Tim Roth with a ridiculous English accent as the hangman. But it's essentially an Agatha Christie story. Obviously things don't go as planned, and there is eruptions of violence and standoffs and the kind of usual. So again, not a great film, but certainly worth seeing, especially on the biggest screen you can find. But strangely enough, flawed. So number 4 is Inglourious Basterds. This is Tarantino's World War II Dirty Dozen homage. I mean, I know one of the issues people have with Tarantino is there's maybe not a lot of originality. He is like a movie magpie. He will take bits from, grindhouse films of the 70s, and bits from war films, and bits from westerns, and bits from this and bits from that. And yes, he puts an original spin on things. His films are always watchable, but is he an original? Not so sure. Again, this is a short one. This is only 153 minutes, and again, should be shorter, but there's so much in it that is so good. I mean, the opening scene where Christoph Waltz, Jew hunter, visits a farm where he thinks Jews are being hidden. I mean, that scene is absolutely beautiful. It looks gorgeous. The dialogue's great. It's just a wonderful opening scene. There's a scene later on in an underground bar with Michael Fassbender, who are meeting a spy, but unfortunately they walk into a bunch of German soldiers having a party. And that scene is full of tension. It's executed brilliantly. He does set pieces very well. It's just a wonderful scene. And that's what's so frustrating about Tarantino, because he can do just great stuff and almost perfect scenes, but then he just has self-indulgences that are really frustrating. So again, I'm assuming most people have seen this. It's essentially a bit of Dirty Dozen with Brad Pitt with a slightly dodgy southern accent. There are videos on YouTube of dialect experts or voice coaches kind of grading people's accents. And the guy, I watched one and the guy said Brad Pitt was in and out with his accent. Some of it was okay and some of it wasn't. Again, there's lots of good stuff in it. And this has a slightly different ending to World War II than reality. I don't know how much of the audience actually thought that this was how it ended, but you never know. So Inglourious Bastards, to me, lots of great stuff in it, but should have been shorter. It's going to be a common theme, I think. Now at number 3 is maybe a controversial pick. It's Pulp Fiction. Now, I'll tell you a little story about Pulp Fiction. When I first saw it in the cinema, I thought it was fantastic. I gave it a 5 out of 5. When it won the Palme d'Or, I was like so excited about it, because here was a kind of outsider, a kind of rebel, winning the Palme d'Or. But I remember a woman coming screaming out of the crowd, shouting abuse at the panel, which I think the chairman was Clint Eastwood. And she was hurling obscenities at them for not giving Shklovsky's Three Colours Red the Palme d'Or. Now at the time, I hadn't seen Three Colours Red. I wasn't aware of Shklovsky. But after seeing Three Colours Red, I'm totally on the side of the woman, because there is nothing in Pulp Fiction that comes close to Three Colours Red. And not ever since that, but I think every time I see Pulp Fiction it kind of goes down in my estimation. It's still a 4, don't get me wrong, but this idea that it's somehow one of the greatest films of all time, or one of the greatest films of the last 30 years, it's just not. Again, there's fantastic things in it, and there's also self-indulgent things in it. For example, Tarantino casting himself, and then casting Steve Buscemi as Buddy Holly in Jack Rabbit Slims for like 2 lines of dialogue, whereas Steve Buscemi could have taken the Jimmy role quite easily and done it a hell of a lot better than Tarantino. That's another thing about Tarantino. I think Harvey Keitel and other people have convinced him that he's somehow a great actor as well, and he does insist in appearing in his films. The most egregious one was in Django Unchained, where for me the whole film grinds to a halt as soon as he turns up with a Dick Van Dyke Australian accent. And that's one of the problems I have with Pulp Fiction. He really could have got an actor to play that part. But again, there's lots of great stuff in it, but it's a little bit overlong. It could have been tighter, but this was the first one that he got a bit more money and a bit more time to do. I like Pulp Fiction. It is number 3 on the list, but the idea that it's a masterpiece is just wrong. This idea that because it chopped and changed with time, people had never seen that before or something, and it's like, maybe mainstream audiences hadn't seen it for a while. Another thing he's responsible for is the resurrection of John Travolta's career. John Travolta was doing the 3rd sequel for Look Who's Talking. That's his world that he was in before Pulp Fiction. And again, he gives a great performance in this, as does obviously Samuel L. Jackson and Uma Thurman. But Tarantino is therefore responsible for the second half of John Travolta's career, which is not really worth talking about. Yeah, enough warbling. Pulp Fiction at number 3, controversially. I know some people would have it at number 1, but not for me, sorry. So number 2 is probably a controversial pick as well. It's Jackie Brown. This is a film, again I saw this one in the cinema as well. It's not surprising that this is his most mature film, because again, one of the issues with Tarantino that I have is his kind of decisions are based on what he considers cool as opposed to what should actually happen. So this is a much more mature film. It was actually based on Elmer Leonard's book, so it's not actually a Tarantino original script, original kind of source. It has older actors in it. He rediscovered Robert Foster, which was a good idea, unlike John Travolta. De Niro's older. He gives a great performance as a bumbling idiot, basically. Samuel L. Jackson is very menacing, which doesn't happen that often. And the star of the show is obviously Pam Grier, who looks fantastic and is fantastic. Any of us who have her 70s films like Coffee and Foxy Brown and Black Mama, White Mama and Friday Foster and Sheba Baby, and we're happy to see her back. This is about money and smuggling and kind of low life characters and double crossing, and it's a really nice film, and it is probably the only Tarantino film that's actually got a heart, so it's not surprising that he didn't actually write it, because the more mature relationship between Pam Grier and Robert Foster is actually quite sweet. Whereas Tarantino is a bit like Spielberg. He can't really... Yes, he writes well for women, but not in a romantic sense, because you kind of get the feeling he doesn't really understand women. The same way Scorsese struggles with female characters, Spielberg struggles with female characters. Spielberg wants to make every woman a tomboy, essentially. And you kind of get that feeling with Tarantino. Yeah, I remember the audience reaction to this was kind of interesting. There's a scene, if people haven't seen it, which I assume most people have, but if you haven't seen it, there's a scene where something happens in a parking lot when two characters can't find the car, and something fairly shocking happens. And I remember there was a lot of people in the audience who laughed at it, and I was sitting there going, that's not actually funny. Now I don't know whether Tarantino thought it was funny, thought it would be cool, but it is actually quite shocking. And yes, this could probably be a little bit shorter. It's actually 154 minutes, but because the characters, you actually care about the characters, unlike quite a lot of his other films, you're invested in the characters. So this is one of his films that doesn't actually feel as long. Yeah, you could maybe take 10 minutes out of it, but it's not as egregious as his other films, where you just sit and go, you could take an hour out of that. So that's why it's number 2. Well, it's a controversial number 2, but it's number 2, and it's Jackie Brown. You can't get enough of Pam Grier, can you? And number 1 is Reservoir Dogs. Now I remember when this came out, it was actually banned in the UK on video because of it was too violent. I remember Emma Thompson of Howard's End fame and other costume dramas saying at the time it was the most violent film she had ever seen. It's like, have you never seen James Bond or Star Wars? I think she got confused with violence and the results of violence, because you don't see a lot of violence in Reservoir Dogs. It's the results, the consequences of violence. Tim Roth rolling about in his own blood isn't violence, it's the result of an act of violence. When he's rolling about in the back of the car, that's not an act of violence, that's the result of an act of violence. I mean, compared to today, you know, I'm surprised this is still actually getting 18, and if it was made today, it would probably get 12. Obviously inspired by The Killing. Again, he messes about with chronology. There's nods to Taking the Pelham 1, 2, 3. There's an obvious nod to City on Fire, the Ringo Lam Hong Kong film with Chow Yun-fat. But the dialogue's so great. Again, we hadn't really seen something like this. It was fresh, and that's why I had so much hope for him after seeing this. But for me, it's not surprising that this is his best film, because it's his shortest film, and it's the film where he didn't have a budget, he didn't have time, so he had to kind of think on the fly of how to do things. Because I guarantee you now, if he was making this in 2018 or 2019, it would be 2.5 hours long. We would probably see Michael Madsen, Mr. Blonde, going mad in the bank robbery. We would see the bank robbery. Oh, sorry, the jewel store robbery. Whereas it's more effective when you hear about it. Great performances by everybody, especially Steve Buscemi. Harvey Keitel is fantastic, and again, you do feel for Harvey Keitel's character at the end, and again, that's why this one and Jackie Brown for me are his top two, because you do actually care about the character. You might not agree with Harvey Keitel's methods, or obviously the way he lives his life, but you do actually feel for him at the end. Well, I do anyway. Obviously I had a career defining performance with Michael Madsen, who's never done anything as good. He does have a nice turn in Kill Bill films, because he's resigned to his fate, and if you've watched any of my videos, you know I like a good bit of fatalism. Yeah, we've all seen Reservoir Dogs. To me, it's the only one of his films I would give 5 out of 5. But again, like I said, his films are interesting. I always watch them when they come out. I always buy them, because there's always something in them. But you just kind of wish that he knew how to edit himself, or he got involved with a collaborator that actually could say to him, you know what, you don't really need that. But again, shooting in 70mm with a Hateful Eight, his films always look beautiful. He always uses really nice locations. His dialogue on the whole, if it doesn't get self-indulgent, is always interesting. Again, he's one of those directors that might not, again, be saying that much, because again, his decisions are basically based on, oh, that's cool, I'll put that in, that's a cool idea. And obviously he's a bit pompous, shall we say. He does have a somewhat overblown idea of his abilities. I remember when he released Django Unchained, he said he was the first director to address slavery. Yeah, I am rambling now, so I'll wrap up. So I don't want to get the impression that I don't like Tarantino. I do like his films, obviously, because I have them all. But he is one of those guys that's just really frustrating, because you see the glimpses of what he's capable of. And again, in Reservoir Dogs, to me, that's the best he's got. But again, feel free to disagree with me in the comments. Leave your top 5. I'd be interested to see. And thank you very much for watching. This is Solitary Ronin saying goodbye and have a lovely evening.